George C. Marshall, the plan's creator. Marshall had been a career military man, and during the war had served as the Army's chief of staff. He oversaw the U.S. military strategy and was one of the key figures behind the Allied victory.
In his final years, General George C. Marshall, the mind behind Allied victory and a Nobel Peace Prize winner, finally spoke about things he'd sworn to keep buried.
The trouble with the Army was, there wasn't any Army, except in name only.
The only solution that I see is to establish a firm front. And the more resolute the front, the more effective it will be.
He hinted that parts of D-Day were never meant for peacetime ears. The few who heard him were shaken. Marshall built his legacy on restraint, not headlines. But before he died, that restraint slipped just enough to point to a darker cost beneath Normandy's glory. The hidden mind behind D-Day. George Catlett. Marshall was never one for the spotlight. While others chased cameras and applause, he built victories from a desk crowded with maps and memos. In Washington, he had a way of unsettling people. He said exactly what he thought, even to the president. During his first major White House meeting in the fall of 1938, Franklin Roosevelt was pushing hard to pour more funds into aircraft production. The room nodded along until Roosevelt turned to the tall, calm officer beside him. "Don't you think so, George?" the president asked. Marshall looked him straight in the eye and said, steady as stone, "I'm sorry, Mr. President, but I don't agree with that at all." The silence that followed could have ended a career. Instead, it defined one. Roosevelt saw in Marshall something rare in politics, honest judgment, and less than a year later, he made him Chief of Staff of the United States Army. It sounded like a job lost in paperwork, but in wartime, it meant everything. The Chief of Staff is the spine of the entire military structure, the person who recruits the right leaders, builds the forces, plans the campaigns, and keeps the whole machine running while others make speeches. When Marshall took that seat on September 1st, 1939, the same day Germany invaded Poland, the American army was tiny, under-equipped, and far from ready for global war. He had to rebuild it from the ground up. New divisions had to be trained, new officers promoted, new factories built to supply them. Every statement he made was measured against one purpose: protecting American lives while ensuring victory when the fight finally came. Over the next few years, that focus made him the center of the Allied war effort. Marshall also had an instinct for people. He could see talent before the world did. His sharpest pick was a once obscure officer named Dwight Eisenhower. After Pearl Harbor, Marshall brought Eisenhower to Washington to help plan the next stage of the war. He watched how Eisenhower handled pressure, how he reasoned through disagreement, and how he united strong personalities without letting them clash. When the Allies prepared for their first major American-led offensive, Operation Torch in North Africa, Marshall decided Eisenhower would command it. The campaign was rough, but Eisenhower proved he could manage a massive coalition under fire. By the summer of 1942, Marshall knew he had found the man who could one day lead the entire European theater. While Eisenhower was earning his first battle scars, Marshall's own front line was a conference table stacked with global maps. From Washington, he oversaw every major debate about where, when, and how the United States would fight in Europe. He believed the most direct and decisive way to defeat Hitler was a cross-channel assault into France, a strike straight into the heart of occupied territory. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill disagreed. He favored attacking the edges first: North Africa, the Mediterranean, Italy, the so-called soft underbelly approach. Those disagreements filled entire conferences: Arcadia in Washington, Casablanca in Morocco, Trident back in Washington, Quadrant in Quebec, and finally Tehran, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met face to face. Each meeting carried the same underlying argument: where should the main blow fall? At last, in Tehran, the Allied leaders reached an agreement. They would launch the long-awaited assault across the English Channel under Operation Overlord, followed by a second landing in southern France once enough landing craft could be gathered. Many wondered why Marshall himself didn't take command of the invasion. He was respected by every Allied leader and feared by none of his subordinates. The truth lay in Roosevelt's calculation. The president had to choose between sending Marshall to Europe or keeping him in Washington to run the entire war machine. In December 1943, Roosevelt made his choice. He handed the European command to Eisenhower. Marshall quietly forwarded the message to Stalin and went back to work. There was no bitterness, no press leaks, no theatrics. He stayed where the war most needed him, at the center of coordination. That decision revealed everything about how Marshall saw power. He never chased prestige, never campaigned for titles. When an envoy approached him in Cairo that same year to ask if he wanted the European command, Marshall's reply was simple. He would go along wholeheartedly with whatever the president decided. He understood that victory depended on the entire Allied system functioning as one: troops, ships, aircraft, fuel, replacements, spare parts, and logistics moving on the same clock. If he left Washington, that coordination could unravel. Roosevelt later said he couldn't sleep soundly unless Marshall was at his post in Washington, holding the wires together. From that desk, Marshall became the ultimate architect of Allied movement. He matched commanders to missions and balanced competing priorities. Every demand for more ships, more aircraft, or another front had to be weighed against the single calendar for France. The British pressed for more attention in the Mediterranean. The Navy wanted resources for the Pacific, and every army general wanted more of everything. Marshall's job was to make all those moving pieces fit without delay or drift. He also prevented the Allied coalition from splitting along national lines. Though unbending on major principles, he treated allies with respect and rarely raised his voice. One day, he could be pressing hard for an exact invasion date. The next, he might support a British proposal that made sense or mediate between feuding commanders. That blend of firmness and flexibility earned him a reputation as the one man who could keep a diverse alliance functioning under stress. Churchill later called him the organizer of victory. The real genius wasn't just in what he built, but in what he made the enemy believe. The Great Deception that saved D-Day. By the end of 1943, General George Marshall had turned the invasion from an idea into a puzzle of dates, ships, planes, and weather. The Allies had to find a small window when the moon, tides, and skies would line up perfectly. The landing had to happen when pilots could see at night, when the tide was high enough for landing craft to get close, but still low enough that the engineers could spot the German obstacles and blow them up before the water covered them again, and when daylight would give troops enough light without making them easy targets. That perfect mix only came for a few days each month, and even then, the weather had to cooperate. The first plan set the invasion for June 5, 1944, but storms rolled across the channel, bringing heavy winds and clouds that could ruin the landings. Eisenhower listened to his weather officers, weighed their reports, and made the call to delay. He moved the date one day forward to June 6th. That single decision gave D-Day its moment in history. Timing, though, was only one part of the load. The invasion depended on air power to clear the skies and to break the German network of railways, bridges, and airfields. Bombers had to make sure that when the invasion came, German planes could not see what was happening or respond fast enough to stop it. Meanwhile, the Allies had to gather thousands of landing craft and ships, and that meant saying no to other operations that could drain those precious resources. While the physical buildup moved ahead, another team worked on something that would never make the front page: a shield of deception. The goal was simple: make the Germans think the main invasion would happen somewhere else. In London, a small office called the London Controlling Section took charge of that effort. It didn't look like much from the outside, but its mission was huge. Its officers had to design a web of believable lies that could protect the real plan. Marshall understood that secrecy and misdirection were weapons just as powerful as tanks or bombers. So, the Americans built a matching group in Washington called Joint Security Control. Together, the two offices wrote what became the Grand Deception Plan for 1944, codenamed Operation Bodyguard. It set the outline for everything that would follow. Bodyguard aimed to convince the Germans that the main Allied assault would come later than planned and in the wrong places. Under that umbrella sat the most famous part of the deception, Operation Fortitude. It came in two parts: Fortitude North and Fortitude South. Fortitude North pretended that the Allies were getting ready to invade Norway, which tied down German divisions far from France. Fortitude South told an even bigger lie, that the real attack would come not in Normandy, but at the Pas de Calais. To sell that lie, the Allies built a phantom army. They called it the First United States Army Group, FUSAG. On maps, it looked real. It even had a famous name attached to it: General George Patton. German intelligence already feared Patton as the most aggressive American field commander. If his name was tied to an army sitting opposite Calais, the Germans would expect him to lead the strike. Across the countryside of southeast England, dummy camps appeared, fields filled with inflatable tanks. Wooden aircraft sat on fake runways. Dummy landing craft floated near the coast. Radio operators sent a steady stream of fake chatter about training, supplies, and troop movements. From the air, the entire region looked alive with preparation. But stage props alone would not have fooled anyone without control of German spies in Britain. The British intelligence agency, MI5, had already captured or turned nearly every German agent operating on British soil. Those agents were forced to feed their masters whatever stories London wanted told. This web of controlled spies became known as the double-cross system. At the center of it stood a Spaniard named Juan Pujol Garcia, codename Garbo. Garbo and his British handler, Tomas Harris, created an imaginary network of sub-agents across Britain. Through them, he sent hundreds of reports to Germany. They sounded real because they contained details that could be verified. Train movements, weather notes, and bits of real information mixed with false conclusions. The Germans believed every word. They even paid him to support his fake network and later awarded him the Iron Cross for his service. After the war, Britain gave him the MBE. Few people in history were decorated by both sides of the same conflict. From January to June 1944, Garbo sent a flood of messages building up the idea of a huge army massing in southeast England for a strike on Calais. Each report supported the last. German analysts compared his information to their aerial photos of dummy camps and found it all consistent. Lies work best when they agree with what people already think they know, and Garbo's reports fit the German picture perfectly. At the same time, another secret weapon gave the Allies a way to check whether the deception was working. It was called Ultra. That code name covered the intelligence the Allies got from decrypting German communications, including messages encoded by the Enigma and Lorenz machines. These intercepted messages told the Allies what the Germans believed and how they were reacting. Marshall relied on Ultra reports to measure the enemy's confusion from thousands of miles away. If German reports mentioned troop movements toward Norway, Fortitude North was working. If they reinforced Calais and ignored Normandy, Fortitude South was paying off. Ultra also gave Allied planners exact details of the German defenses, where their guns were placed, who commanded what sector, and what reinforcements were on the move. The true measure of the deception's success was what the enemy failed to do. When Allied forces landed in Normandy, the German 15th Army stayed near Calais, waiting for a second invasion that never came. Hitler and many of his top officers remained convinced that Normandy was a diversion. Operation Bodyguard had aimed to hold the Germans in place for at least 2 weeks. In reality, their hesitation lasted much longer. That delay gave the Allies enough time to build up strength on the beaches and push inland. Fortitude North's quieter mission also paid off. It kept German divisions tied to Norway, where they stayed in fear of a strike that never came. The Germans could not risk losing their northern ports or the flow of iron ore from Scandinavia. The deception worked because it played on real German fears. From Washington, George Marshall kept the focus on the main goal. He backed Eisenhower's requests and made sure resources went where they were needed most. He also supported strict information control, known in military language as compartmentation. Only those who had to know the details were told them. Marshall didn't write the lies, but he protected the system that made them possible. The deception worked better than anyone hoped, but nothing could prepare them for the reality of D-Day. What really happened on D-Day? Just after midnight on June 6, 1944, a short coded message reached George Marshall. The invasion had begun. Paratroopers had jumped. The Sea Fleet was on the move through heavy weather. For months, everyone had waited for this moment. Now it was happening in darkness, wind, and rain. Planes flew blind through low clouds. Strong currents pushed landing boats off course. Across the French countryside, the paratroopers hit the ground, scattered and confused, landing in fields, orchards, and hedgerows. Some found their units. Many didn't. From the sea came the steady thunder of naval guns pounding the coast before dawn. Every officer in Washington reading those first messages wanted to know only one thing. When daylight came, would the invasion hold? The assault was always going to be bloody, and the planners knew it. The senior surgeons for the 1st United States Army warned their teams to expect at least 12,000 killed or wounded in the first 24 hours. They feared chemical attacks. They feared air raids. They feared the weather breaking down before the men could land. So they built a huge medical system to pull the wounded off the beaches quickly. They planned evacuation routes, floating hospitals, and field units that could start treating injuries within minutes. When daylight arrived, it revealed the truth of the night. At Utah Beach, the tide and current pushed most of the assault force about a mile away from where it was supposed to land. It looked like a mistake, but it turned out to be a lucky one. They hit a weaker section of the defenses and pushed inland faster than planned. The rest of the coast was not so forgiving. By the end of the day, the Allies had taken just over 10,000 casualties across all 5 landing zones, killed, wounded, or missing. About 2,400 of those losses came from one stretch of sand, Omaha Beach. Those numbers explain why Omaha still stands out, and Marshall would later call it the price of entry into Europe. Omaha was a narrow strip of sand backed by steep cliffs that rose like a wall. German defenses covered every approach. The open beach offered no shelter. Behind the dunes were bunkers, machine gun nests, and mortar pits built into solid concrete. The shoreline itself was covered with wooden stakes, mines, and metal traps meant to tear open landing craft. To make things worse, the air bombardment that morning had missed. The bombers had dropped their loads too far inland, afraid of hitting friendly troops waiting offshore. So when the first wave of landing craft approached, most of the German strongpoints were still untouched. The sea added its own trouble. The men of the 741st Tank Battalion had planned to send their Sherman tanks ashore with collapsible canvas screens and small propellers. These DD tanks, short for duplex drive, were supposed to swim the last few miles to the beach, but the waves were too rough. Of the 29 tanks launched in that sector, 27 sank before reaching shore. The infantry lost nearly all of their armor support before the battle even began. The German troops waiting on the bluffs were no pushovers. The Allies had expected a static coastal unit with little training. Instead, parts of the 352nd Infantry Division, a much stronger and better trained formation, had been moved in. They had clear lines of fire over the sand. Anyone trying to cross that open space faced mortars, machine guns, and artillery all at once. Commanders were killed before they could give orders. The plan, as written, collapsed within minutes. But in that confusion, small groups of soldiers began to improvise. Engineers crawled through the sand and water to clear mines and obstacles. Junior officers rallied anyone nearby, infantry, medics, engineers, whoever they could find, and started moving inland wherever there was cover. The Navy's destroyers saw the slaughter and did something no one had ordered. They moved closer, so close they risked grounding, and fired directly into the cliffs. Their shells blasted the German gun positions until the gunners had to duck. Those few minutes of relief gave the troops below a chance to crawl forward. By late morning, scattered groups of Americans had reached the base of the hills. They climbed through craters, ditches, and smoke, fighting from one position to the next. It wasn't a clean breakthrough. It was dozens of small fights linked by instinct and grit. By nightfall, Omaha Beach was still deadly, but it was no longer lost. The foothold was there. The other beaches had their own stories. At Gold, Juno, and Sword, British and Canadian forces met mixed resistance. Some areas light, others fierce. But by evening, all had their own toeholds in France. The question now was speed. Could the Allies bring in reinforcements faster than the Germans could counterattack? By June 7th and 8th, the battle was changing shape. Engineers turned the beaches into highways. Bulldozers pushed ramps through the dunes. Beach crews directed traffic so tanks, jeeps, and trucks didn't block each other. Even with wind and rain, the supply lines kept running. By June 11th, 5 days after the landings, more than 326,000 troops and over 100,000 tons of supplies had crossed the channel. The Germans were still dangerous, but they were slow. Allied bombers had torn up the railways and bridges across northern France, so reinforcements couldn't move easily. Fighter planes hunted their convoys by day, and even more importantly, the German high command still thought the Normandy invasion might be a trick. They expected another, larger attack at Calais. Because of that, they held many of their best divisions back, waiting for a second invasion that would never come. A few days after the landings, something happened that most people never heard about. On June 8th, General George C. Marshall and the rest of America's top military commanders left Washington and flew to England. 2 days later, they met their British counterparts, and on June 12th, they crossed the channel to see the beaches themselves. The trip was kept secret. The war was still raging only a few miles away. They rode to shore in a DUKW, an amphibious truck that could float like a boat and drive like a truck. They visited field hospitals, talked with soldiers, and inspected the new artificial harbor being built off Omaha. That harbor, made of giant concrete pieces and sunken ships, was called a mulberry. It would allow ships to unload supplies directly onto floating piers, instead of waiting for a captured port. Their report back to Washington was that the beachheads were holding. Morale was strong. The airborne troops had done well, and the artificial harbor was coming together faster than expected. By the end of the first week, the Allied foothold had grown from scattered points to a connected line along the coast. Every day, more tanks, guns, and vehicles came ashore. When the war was over, Marshall didn't celebrate. He went to work again. How George Marshall rebuilt a broken world. After the beaches were secured, George Marshall didn't celebrate or take a victory tour. In public, he praised the troops, thanked the Allies, and then moved on. When reporters tried to pull him into long stories about how the invasion worked, he gave short answers. That wasn't modesty, it was discipline. There were things about the operation he couldn't discuss, and not because there was a failure to hide. Some of the most important tools behind D-Day's success were still classified, and he treated them that way. One of those secrets was Ultra, the Allied system for reading German military messages. For almost 30 years after the war, the public had no idea it had ever existed. When the truth finally became public in the mid-1970s, many wartime stories had to be rewritten. When the war ended, Marshall turned his focus to a different kind of battle. Europe was shattered, cities were in ruins, factories were silent, and millions faced hunger and cold. Marshall saw the danger clearly. A continent that had been destroyed by war could easily be destroyed again by despair. So, on June 5, 1947, standing in Harvard Yard, he spoke about rebuilding. He said, if the United States wanted peace, it had to help Europe recover, restore industry, stabilize currencies, and restart trade. He didn't talk about enemies. He talked about hunger, poverty, and chaos. The plan would come from Europe. America would only help fund it. That short, plain speech became the seed of the European Recovery Program, the Marshall Plan. Congress turned that idea into law on April 3, 1948. Over the next 4 years, the United States sent about $13 billion in aid to 16 European countries. Each country receiving aid had to coordinate its plans with the others through a new group called the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. On the American side, a new agency, the Economic Cooperation Administration, handled the logistics. Shipments of grain, coal, and machinery came first, followed by technical training and industrial support. The goal was simple: get people back to work and rebuild daily life. By the time the program ended, most of Western Europe's farms and factories were producing more than they had before the war. The politics behind it were rough. Not everyone in Congress wanted to send billions overseas. Many Americans were tired of war and worried about spending so much money abroad. Moscow called the plan a trick, a U.S. attempt to dominate Europe. But events on the ground shifted public opinion. Coal shortages, food rationing, and the communist coup in Czechoslovakia in early 1948 showed what could happen if Europe stayed weak and divided. Marshall stayed steady through the arguments. He kept repeating the same point. This was not charity, and it was not a weapon. It was a practical way to stop chaos from spreading. For that work, Marshall received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953. The award recognized his proposal and supervision of the plan for Europe's recovery. A career soldier winning the world's top peace award could have felt strange, but in his case, it made perfect sense. Marshall had spent his life fighting wars, yet his greatest contribution was helping prevent another one. The Nobel simply confirmed what people around the world already believed, that he was steady, practical, and more interested in results than recognition. After leaving public office, General George C. Marshall returned to his home, Dodona Manor in Leesburg, Virginia. He kept a quiet routine, reading, welcoming a few visitors, and staying involved with education and exchange programs that had grown out of his post-war work. His health began to decline in the late 1950s. A stroke early in 1959 sent him to an Army hospital near Fort Bragg, and later that year he was moved to Walter Reed as doctors worked to manage further complications. On October 16, 1959, General Marshall died at Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, D.C., at the age of 78 after suffering a series of strokes. The White House announced his death the same day. His funeral was held with the simplicity he preferred. At noon on October 19th, his casket was brought to Bethlehem Chapel at Washington National Cathedral, where it lay in repose for 24 hours. On October 20th, a service was held at Fort Myer Chapel before the procession moved the short distance to Arlington National Cemetery. There, in a private graveside ceremony, he was laid to rest. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.